Hello, welcome to this tutorial on Klusterbox. In this video I will explain how to input clock rings into Klusterbox. Now the first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to open up Klusterbox right here. You're going to want to make sure your date is set to the appropriate date and your investigation range is the proper investigation range. So we're investigating the service week of October 6th through Friday, October 12th. And if that's incorrect, you're going to want to set that to the proper date, or whatever date you're investigating. Now, we've already built the carrier list. I did that in a previous video. And so you only have two major jobs in Klusterbox. The first one is building and maintaining your carrier list. And the second one is entering in the clock rings. So your clock rings are, well, first I can't show you the employee everything report, I think. Now you need a employee everything report to get the clock rings from. I think that's restricted information, and I guess I have a bunch of them I could put up on the screen, but I'm just not going to take that chance. I don't know if that's allowed or not. So, and anyway, these are kind of fictitious names anyway, so I don't have a fictitious employee everything report to go along with that. But if you're doing improper mandate grievances, you should know what an employee everything report is, and if you don't, then you should, I guess, request the employee everything report, and then you can kind of follow along with what I'm talking about here. Now, the first thing you're going to want to do as you're going through your employee everything report is you're going to find the first name of a carrier on this list. So you'd scroll down and you'd click, say the first name is Gillum. So you'd click that name and up pops this screen. Now this is where you enter in your clock rings, and it's got the name on top, the list that they're on. This is no list, the routes that they're on. This guy's a floater, so he's got 5 routes, and it also, in red, it highlights the NS day. So this person's NS day is on Saturday for that service week. On the bottom you have these buttons: submit, apply, go back. So we're going to go back now. Okay, and then for the so you have the same format of screen for carriers who are on no list and on work assignment. So the screen looks the same. And then for carriers who are on the overtime desired list, the screen looks like this. And for carriers who are on auxiliary, the screen looks like that. So the screen for the OTDL carriers and the auxiliary carriers look the same, and the screen for the no list carriers and the work assignment list carriers look the same. So the first thing you're going to want to do is for no list carriers, right? When you're looking through the employee everything report, you're going to want to take note of 3 things. You're going to want to see if they went over into overtime, in which case you would write down their time, the 5200 code, which is the total amount of hours worked on that day. You would write down the total amount of hours worked on that day in this 5200 field. I call it the 5200 because that's what it's listed as in the employee everything report. So if you see that report, you just look for the 5200, and that'll give you the total hours worked on that day. Then you also want to take note of any moves on and off the route. So you'll see, moves, from a carrier's own route, and here's a handy reference, so you can know that they're on route 5, And so if they move off of that, you take note of, okay, they moved off at 16.90, and then they moved back at 17 and 98 clicks. Right? So you take note of moves on and off the route, and then you would also take note of if they worked their NS day. Now the NS day is highlighted in red, so if you entered it in. If you didn't enter it in, then it won't show an NS day. But if you built the carrier list to reflect the NS day, then it'll show up. And for work assignment list carriers, it's the same thing, except you really don't need to enter in. You don't need to enter in overtime on their own route, because that's not a violation. So you'd really only want to pay attention to whether they worked off of their own route, which you would show here, moved off and then moved on, and then you would show if they worked on their NS day. And say they did work on their NS day, you would just enter in the total amount of hours they worked on their NS day, and you would toggle this to NS day, and that would make note that they worked on their NS day that day. Okay, and let's see here. Oh, also one other thing, this RS, that means return to station. Now, that's optional. You don't have to fill that out, but sometimes it's an issue if dispatcher value comes into question. Now, return to station is typically the move to office or before the end tour. That's typically what it is. So it's the time that they're getting off of the street and returning to the station. I think in future versions of Klusterbox, I might make the visibility of this field optional, depending on whether you want to use it or not. Because not in all cases will you need to use it. It's just a very specific set of circumstances where you might want to use it, where you have to prove that carriers were out past the dispatcher value. But in a lot of cases you won't need it, so you could just skip over it. And in the cases where you do need it, you only need to enter it in where the carriers were out past the dispatcher value. So, all right. So I also want to show, I want to demonstrate a couple things, like how to enter in the information. So let's go down to Jones here. Okay. So say Jones, you want to enter in, he worked 8.8 hours and 26 clicks on Saturday. And you can tab down past Sunday, didn't work Sunday. And on Monday he worked 8 hours, but that was his NS day. So you could signify that by highlighting NS day. I guess you could also put in the move off and move on and enter the begin tour and end tour for move off and move on, but this NS day just allows you to toggle that, and that'll show that that whole 8 hours was worked off of that carrier's own route. Now, one of the reasons I wrote this program was to create this this next thing I'm going to show you, which is multiple move functionality. Now, what multiple moves functionality is when a carrier moves off and then moves back onto the route multiple times. So I'll show you what that looks like. So say the carrier worked 10 hours and 35 clicks that day, and so you tab over to move, and then they worked 8.73 clicks to 9.10 clicks, but they moved they did more moving off of the route than that. So you click more moves and it gives you an extra set of fields. Now you go to 950 clicks and 9 and 82 clicks. But they moved more than that, so you press more moves, and then 1132 and 1250. Okay, and then you could just press, apply or submit. So let's press apply. This regenerates this puts all these numbers into the database and then reformats them. So you can see that these moves are still there. Now there are certain formats you have to follow when you're entering in these numbers. Like you can't enter in like 8:30. Like if they worked 8 hours and 30 minutes, it has to be in clicks, right? If you use the colon, it's going to give you an error. So okay, so it says you must enter a numeric value for 5200 for Wednesday. See, so it doesn't even recognize that. And it's going to spit it back out, and it's going to be blank. Also, if you try to put 0 in there, it doesn't accept values that are less than or equal to 0. So it's going to throw an error there. But now, to show you this, what this looks like now, with this multiple move functionality and this NS day, we can go out and we can go to the spreadsheet. No, not the spreadsheet. We can go to output. I'll cover spreadsheets in another video. So let's see here. On Saturday, Jones worked 8 hours, right? So you can see the 8 hours and 26 clicks, and it shows up right there as overtime. Okay, on Tuesday, or on Monday, Jones worked, he's on the work assignment list, he worked his NS day. Now this is going to say NS day in the note column, and under 5200 it's going to say 8 hours, and then it's going to show 8 hours of overtime, 8 hours off of his own route, and then 8 hours as overtime off route. So because he worked his NS day, everything is overtime off of his own route. Now for Tuesday, we did the multiple move functionality thing, and that's going to show Jones, he worked 10 hours and 35 clicks, and then it shows these moves here. He moved on and off of his off and on his route 3 times. So it gives you the total of each move on this column, and then the total amount of overtime in this column, but there's a little bit of pivot time in there. So he worked off of his route for less than what the overtime, less than the total overtime. So there was some pivot time there, and the total overtime off of his route was 1 hour and 87 clicks. So we can go back to the main screen, and okay, there's a couple other things to show you here for the output. Okay, now one thing. Let's see here. We'll move to Tuesday. Now, one thing you might notice about this that seems a little bit off, if you're observant, is this carrier worked 8 hours and 7 clicks on this day. But when you go over to overtime, it shows that it's 0. Now that's not a bug of the program. That's actually a feature. It's called a tolerance. Because I don't want to deal with 7 clicks of overtime, so I just it won't even recognize it. But if you do want to recognize it, if you're uncomfortable with that whole concept of of a tolerance of, if you want to capture those 7 clicks, then you could go back to the main screen, go to Configuration, Tolerances, and then you could just set the tolerances to 0. And it sets all these to 0. You can go back and go back to Output, Tuesday, and under Adams, he worked 8 hours and 7 clicks. It shows those 8 hours, or it shows those 7 clicks overtime right there. Now, I set the default tolerance to 1.25, which is 15 minutes. But you can set them to whatever you want if you want to use them at all. The maximum tolerance is 1 hour. I figure if you're going over an hour of tolerance, you're a bit too lenient. But you have the leeway that you want to use, whatever it is. Now I have one set of tolerances for overtime for carriers on the on no list. So it's sort of letter carrier paragraph, if you're familiar with that, those types of grievances. And then there's another tolerance for overtime off route for carriers on no list and work assignment list. So that'll be a tolerance for these columns here. And then there's another tolerance for availability to the availability to 12, or the availability to 10 hours and 12 hours for both of these lists. So all 4 of these columns. So that's the availability tolerance, and I believe right now it's set to 0. But okay, we could see one right here. So say Cleese is he has an availability to 10 hours of 0.24 clicks, 0.24 clicks, or 24 clicks. Right, to availability to 10 hours, and that could be relevant in cases where carriers on no list are working overtime on their own routes, right? So that could be an issue. But if you don't want to recognize that, if less than 15 minutes of time is just not enough to squabble over, you could just go back and go to tolerances and restore the defaults, and that'll give you 25 clicks of tolerance in each one of those categories. So you go back to Output on Saturday, place, and it now those 24 clicks of availability disappear, so you won't have to see them. Okay, go back. Now filling out the clock rings for people on auxiliary is pretty simple. You just enter in the 5200 code, and there's the codes look a little bit differently. They look a little bit different. Again, the return to station is optional. You don't have to use it at all. But the default is none for the codes, and then no call. What that means is the carrier wasn't called in to work that day. The carrier wasn't scheduled to work that day. The idea is that a supervisor has some time when he's making out the schedule in the morning, or if he's if he's had call-ins and stuff, and they need extra people to work that day, before they go out and start mandating people on off the workroom floor who are not on the list, they should call up people who are on the list or who are auxiliary carriers, and they should call them and offer them that work, as opposed to mandating people off the list. So that's what that would be for. And what that does is it maxes out the availability. It maxes out the availability to 10 and 12. The rest of these they zero out the availability. So if someone's sick, obviously they can't work. If they're on light duty, they can't work the full day, so it zeroes out the availability. Same with schedule change, annual leave, sick leave, excused. So if say it's somebody's NS day and they need to get their car fixed, it's going to take them all day, then you would say, well, they just can't come in that day. That's just something that we're going to have to deal with. So you put excused, and it gives you that information in the output and in the spreadsheet. So this guy had annual that day, so there's no availability. And that's about it. That's all you need to know for entering in clock rings. So, all right, thanks.